How I came to be wandering alone in the cold at night in the middle of October with no place to stay is irrelevant to what I have to explain. As far as you are concerned, it could be any number of reasons. A fight with a significant other, a drug-induced dementia, or perhaps I was fleeing the police after a bloody shootout. Maybe it was all three of the aforementioned possibilities, but it doesn't matter as long as you know that I ended up wandering down a dark street into a strange neighborhood until I came to a long drive where the trees closed over the path like a tunnel. I followed that road up a tall hill, wading through the leaves until I came to a dismal black house sitting at the top. It was a small two-story structure built with a rustic cabin-like aesthetic. There were timbers falling from the upper balcony, and the lower foundation seemed cracked and on the verge of collapse. I gazed at the ground floor sliding glass windows covered in green mold from the inside and thought only of shelter from the cold and the authorities who may or may not have been following me. I pushed the latch free from the rotted frame and entered a dark limbo of rot and mildew as I searched for a light switch. This proved a false and naive hope, as I sat in the center of the room and tried to calm the maelstrom of anxiety and delusion which threatened to crack my mind. I could hear the house groaning and swaying around me as I held myself and rocked front to back, a man on the verge of mental collapse. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and now I realized that I had entered into the basement. There were warped, cobweb-laden rafters bending over my head as I longed to find a single, clean, warm spot in which to rest. The frantic pounding of my heart gradually slowed as the darkness and sorrow doused the fires of my hysteria with abysmal waves of hopelessness and shame at what had occurred previously that evening. I could remember screams and gunshots. I could see blood and the flashing police lights. I could smell. No, there are no memories which could override the powerful and violating odor of the house's mold. I fought barely with closed eyes and clenched teeth to contain the agony of disbelief at the terrifying reality I'd left behind in the outside world. My life was effectively and for all purposes over. Never would anything ever be normal, safe, or bright again. My existence had fallen irreparably into shadow, sunken into a thick and corrosive mire of corruption and blackness. It was with this feeling of being crushed by the weight of a vast and never-ending night that I fell into unconsciousness, weeping like a newly orphaned child. When I awoke, I cannot properly ascertain, as I may have slept for hours or only for a few brief minutes. My impression was only of having briefly slipped into a quick, flashing rest from my torment, and yet the shadows had so moved that I know some longer span of time must have passed. I leaned back stiffly and shivered as I watched a burst of steam spill from my mouth, coughing with sore and corroded lungs. All was clear now. The illegal anesthetic, which had vaguely numbed the tragic consequence of my actions, had now lifted, and sharp, killing reality descended. Through all the haze of morose horror, a curiosity awakened when I saw a slow movement across the room. There was a small rectangle of lunar brilliance high on the far wall, which peered out into a piled jumble of frozen leaves. Beneath this radiance, something had crept to the side under the ruined stairs which led up to the next floor. I squinted to catch some clear glimpse of what could possibly be lying only a few paces away, watching me from the sanctuary of shadows. I could see the dark outline rising and falling with deliberate, uneven breaths. I felt a sudden irrational urge to laugh as I contemplated the possibilities of whom my comrade hiding in the dark may be. A dog, or maybe a homeless person? But no, for something inexplicable within me communicated a deep and intuitive warning of menace from the lurking presence. As I watched, a portion of the dark mass extended out like the limb of a crooked black tree and slowly exposed itself in the moonlight. It was a bare gray bone stained with pink blood and rotted sinew, topped with an outstretched skeleton talon with 3 long digits, and on one side, grown thumb of sharp and gleaming ivory. This hand was outstretched to me from the darkness, as if this horror expected me to accept it in my own. I fell back and crawled frantically for the door, but found that there was none. Where I was sure the glass had been was only bare lichen-covered brickwork. My mind raced as I attempted to convince myself that this was only some hallucination, much like the delusion which had driven me into this state. But I could see there were dozens of reaching, broken arms writhing from some central tangled mass of convulsing flesh and jutting labyrinths of intertwined bone. There was a mouth, or more likely, a chasm of bottomless hungry fangs. Of all things which lay pooled in this swamp of appendage and horror, it lacked only eyes. This thing, it sought me by the smell of my terror and the sound of my breath. From where could this thing have come? Had it lay in wait for years in the basement, or had it sprung from the depths of my shattered mind? How could the features of the room have so quickly altered, and where could I now find any hope of escape? I stared at the framework of the ruined stairs and imagined maybe there lay some possibility. There was only a moment for me to calculate as it was moving, or more correctly, spilling its remains across the floor towards me. I stood and sprinted to the splintered bottom step, and no sooner had my foot landed upon it than it cracked and gave away beneath my weight. I scrambled and clawed, screaming as I felt a hand close over my ankle. Searing pain shot through my leg as the flesh was torn and ripped by the barbed and acidic touch of the swimming mire of decay. The stairs above held as I pulled and struggled free, leaving a fabric of flesh dangling in the grip of the nightmare which was amassing below. I pulled with all my strength and climbed the creaking, trembling structure until I fell upon the carpet of the upstairs landing. Laughing out loud, I crawled across the floor through the darkness towards the door which I saw waiting only a few feet away. I slammed into it and struggled with the lock until the knob turned and I felt the cold blast of fresh autumn air hit me like a blessed freedom. I ran out into the withered porch and down the stairs until I once more felt frozen ground and crunching leaves beneath my steps. I fell to my knees, calling triumphantly as I threw the dried multitudes of red and orange in celebration of my escape. It was only then that I noticed the lights and the presence of the shadows standing around me. The police gathered in a throng and lifted me up as I gazed into their stern and cold expressions with the wonder of a newly born lunatic. "What do you think?" one said to the others. "It'll save us paperwork," another responded casually as they cuffed my shaking hands behind my back. Then, as if carrying out some perfunctory task, I looked in shock as they began to drag me back towards the house. "No! No!" I screamed as they lifted me back up the stairs to the still open front door. "You can't put me in there!" I yelled to them. "There's something in the basement!" The officer looked at me calmly and smiled as I was held flailing and kicking at the doorstep. "Yeah, we know." I was thrown back into the darkness within, and the door slammed behind. I stood, beating hysterically at the door as I watched them, holding it closed from outside, laughing and joking as I heard the slow, crawling movements on the floor behind me. I turned to see the mass pouring out across the floor of the upstairs, as if increasing its volume via self-expansion. My back to the door, I slid down into a ball and watched its slow approach with complete disbelief. There was no way I could accept the circumstances in which I had found myself. I had awakened this morning and sat calmly in the kitchen of my apartment drinking coffee with my girlfriend as she read amusing notations from her social network page. Everything had been calm and ordinary. However, at some point, reality had begun to slide, to degenerate until at some critical connecting nerve of perception, a break had occurred. From that starting line, I had been racing frantically forward to this final horrific moment. I watched as the windows of the living room first darkened and then disappeared as they vanished into solid wall. The door was gone. Light became a shadow, and all hope was lost. Tommy had called and said he had some killer haze, a new designer hallucinogen, created as a synthesis of the narcotic poison of some millipede, which a rare species of lemur was known to bite non-lethally, then rub on their fur to get high. He promised that the trip would be like nothing I'd ever experienced before. He had been correct. It had transformed the world into a floating, viscous symphony of colliding sights and sounds. Rochella had become at once beautiful and yet terrifying simultaneously. She had been experiencing some strange eruption of nightmares from her unconscious, and she had terrified me. The revolver was already loaded and sitting in the kitchen junk drawer. This had all been a hallucination. There was no possible way that I had killed Rochella. Just like this house, like this nightmare, it had not been real. There had been no police. I had not shot 2 officers on my way out the window onto the fire escape. As I watched the bizarre and distorted figment of my maddened brain seem to produce a shadow of flesh, which rose glistening and pale from a mass of moving, shifting decomposition. I stared on with wonder as I recognized the naked, pale, bleeding body as that of Rochella. She stretched out her arms in pleading fashion as her wide blue eyes gazed out from beneath the long, sweat-soaked, dyed red hair which hung over her face, the bullet hole, a small spewing orifice over her left breast. Her entire lower body was lost in the pulsing horror of limbs and disemboweled black organs which had covered the hallway, like a oil slick consuming some unfortunate coastline. "I didn't do it," I was shouting at the morose apparition as it emerged beautiful and appalling in its awful foreboding majesty. "It was all a mistake. It didn't happen. None of this is real." "It is as real as any other moment you have ever yet experienced," her corpse answered with a voice low and malevolent. "Your fate was sealed the moment you answered the phone and accepted Tommy's offer. The second that you took the haze into your hand, you may as well have hung a sign around your neck reading 'Condemned,' the same as that which is taped to the entrance of this house. Every action you took from the moment was bringing you closer to the thing which you see before you, this animated assembly of sacrifices made by a cult of killers living within these walls, tossed into a pit hidden beneath the floor of the basement." In my mind, I could see the police raiding the premises and coming upon the horror. I could see their faces sickened by the foul, rotting stew of human decomposition and rot. Over the years, they came to know the house well as its reputation grew and more residents fled or were killed by the thing which could only emerge at night. It was rumored that the original owners had summoned an entity of tremendous darkness to exist among them. And here it remained, lurking and waiting over the years, even as its shelter fell into disrepair and dilapidation. The officers had ceased to speak of the evil, which no one would ever believe existed should they choose to tell. Can you not see that this house is your twin? Ruined, infested, and fated for destruction. Don't you long to be forgiven? Don't you want to be punished for what you have done? But I couldn't have done it, Rochella. You did! There was a menace inside you that mirrors this house, and now it will devour you whole. Let it dismember you, Ben. Let it rend you into pieces of torn, bleeding disease. Stop running from the inevitable and let your cowardice die and your pathetic soul be forgiven. Come to me and be one with me in this seething pool of cancerous, writhing death. I was bathed in the hatred and judgment of her cold and unrelenting stare, and I knew that there was no other choice but the path which lay before me. In my mind, I saw the day played out over and over in a continuous loop of error and moral weakness. Stumbling to my feet, hands still shackled, I began to walk towards my beloved Rochelle, as the numerous reaching horrid claws stretched out to greet me with their own embrace. For one moment, as I was cocooned in the lurid, writhing mass of human decomposition, I looked into her eyes and I felt a scream erupting from within my chest. Her face had melted away, and what gazed back was now only a bare, eyeless visage of pale, transparent skin with a wide, stretching mouth filled with sharp, needle-like teeth. This gaping orifice was set in such a way as to portray what I could only describe as an enormous, maddening smile, which spanned so wide as to appear that it open and could leave my neck a bleeding stump with a single bite. Then, with the same bony three-fingered claw I had first seen in the moonlight, it cupped the back of my head and drew my face close until I could feel its cold, damp, vile breath on my cheek. It was then that within the terrified hysteria of my mind it spoke. But now its voice was low, male, and buzzing like a swarm of wasps within my brain. Rochelle lives, Ben. I realized that it was laughing now, mocking me, as I began to struggle against the burning, tearing claws which were grabbing and probing at my body. You never killed anyone. There were no police, Ben. You never even fired the gun. But the police outside, I gasped, as the force of its hold began to increase until my lungs could no longer expand to breathe. There were no police. There were no handcuffs on your wrists. You were free, Ben. You made it out, and then you turned and walked back in. Its laughter was cold and maniacal. I am in your mind, Ben. The drug had made your soul an open beacon, and I saw it shining in the night. I called to you, and you came. I whispered, and you saw only what I wanted you to see. This isn't real!